The morning Catherine Aldridge stepped out of her black Bentley, she looked up at the rust-bitten sign of a small repair shop on the edge of the industrial district, and she laughed. Not loudly. Just a soft, brief sound, pitched precisely so the people standing beside her would hear it. The entourage caught it. They looked away because that is the correct response when a CEO sees something unworthy of her attention. What Catherine did not know was that the man inside that shop, quietly wiping his hands on a grease rag, had designed the control systems that 3 of her production lines ran on every single day. She did not know that in that exact moment, he had already decided what he was going to do next. So who was the man inside that small repair shop, really? The shop sat at the edge of the industrial district, on a stretch of road, where the streetlights came on later than they should have, and the signs above the doorways had stopped pretending to be new sometime in the last decade. Hartwell Repair and Machining. The letters had been hand-painted onto a sheet of mounted steel once in a darker time, when somebody believed signs deserved care. Now the corners were rust-bitten, and the lower edge wore a thin orange seam where the rain came down through the bracket each fall. Daniel Hartwell was 39 years old, and most mornings he opened the shop before the sun made it all the way over the warehouse roofs across the street. He was the kind of man who kept the inside of a building cleaner than the outside, the kind whose pegboard tools hung in their painted outlines as though they had been placed by a careful hand and never moved. He swept the concrete floor every morning, whether or not the previous day had brought a customer. The discipline was older than the shop. It came from somewhere else. What few people knew, because Daniel was not in the habit of explaining himself, was that he had spent 11 years before this as a senior systems engineer at Meridian Engineering, one of the larger industrial automation firms on the eastern seaboard. He had designed control architectures for production lines across 7 states. Along the way, 7 patents had been registered with his name on the inventor line, all of them held under Meridian's standard intellectual property agreement, which meant the company owned the patents, and Daniel's name simply existed on the federal record. When firms like Aldridge Industrial bought their control equipment from Meridian, they bought the license to run it along with the metal. None of them ever looked at the inventor field. There was no reason to. He had not left Meridian because the work had failed him. He had left because his wife had died when Lily was 18 months old, and somebody had to be home before the school bus. He had been the one who could leave. So he had. The shop was not where his life happened. It was only where part of it happened. The rest of it happened in a small house 20 minutes away, where a 6-year-old girl woke up most mornings with her hair pointing in 2 different directions and asked detailed questions about breakfast. On the corner of Daniel's main workbench beside the calibration gauges and the coffee mug with a hairline crack he kept meaning to replace, sat a small white plush rabbit named Biscuit. The rabbit had button eyes and one ear that was visibly more frayed than the other. Lily handed him over every morning before the bus came, with the seriousness of someone assigning a guard. Daniel's reputation in the industrial trade moved the way real reputations move slowly sideways between people who had no incentive to lie about it. A plant manager mentioned him to a shift supervisor. The shift supervisor remembered him a year later when something on his line went wrong that nobody could explain. The whole reputation collapsed down to a single sentence that traveled through the region's break rooms and parking lots and union halls without any encouragement from Daniel himself. If a machine breaks down and nobody can fix it, call Hartwell. He did not advertise. He had no website. There was a phone number, and there was the sign, and that was the full marketing operation. He did not need any more than that. The people who needed him already knew where he was. It was a Tuesday in early October when the second plant of Aldridge Industrial, the 3rd largest manufacturer of metal components in the Northeast, went completely dark on its main line. The CNC system seized at 6:43 in the morning. A cascade fault spread across the entire control board, freezing the diagnostic displays mid-readout. The on-site technical team 3 men with combined experience approaching 40 years worked the problem for 3 hours and could not locate the root cause. They could see the symptoms. They could not see what was generating them. The error codes kept rotating in a sequence that did not match anything in the documentation. The Aldridge plant had a defense contractor delivery scheduled in 48 hours, with penalty clauses for late shipment, and a customer relationship that the sales department had been protecting for 2.5 years. The CFO of Aldridge Industrial called 2 of the larger maintenance contracting firms in the region. Both said the same thing in slightly different phrasing: earliest available technician, 72 hours. He called the manufacturer's support line and was placed on hold. He waited 11 minutes before he hung up without leaving a message. At 8:20 in the morning, he called Catherine Aldridge directly. She listened to the first 30 seconds of his explanation. Her response was 4 words long: "Fix it by noon." The line went dead before he had finished forming his next sentence. He stood at his desk for a moment, with the phone still warm in his hand. Then he called the plant manager, a man with 22 years of operations, experience, the kind of operator who had been on the floor of 3 different companies before walking through Aldridge's front door 8 years ago. The plant manager listened. He said he knew somebody who might be able to help. He could not guarantee anything. The man ran a small shop and might not pick up the phone. The CFO asked for the number. Before the plant manager hung up, he added one more thing in the tone of someone passing along information that the receiver would want later, whether he realized it now or not. He said this man had once diagnosed a cascade fault in 4 minutes. The same fault he said that a certified field engineering team from the manufacturer had spent 2 days getting wrong. The CFO wrote the number down on the edge of a yellow legal pad. He looked at it for a few seconds before he dialed. He did not know when he placed the call that he was about to introduce his company to the man whose name was etched in small federal type on the patent records for the equipment that had just failed. He did not know, because nobody at Aldridge Industrial had ever been the type to look. The control systems worked. That was as deep as anyone in the building had been required to read. Across town, in a quiet shop with hand-painted letters on a rusted sign, the phone rang on a workbench beside a white plush rabbit and a cracked coffee mug. It rang twice. Then it was answered. The call lasted 4 minutes. Daniel asked 3 questions in the order he always asked them, not as a procedure, but as a way of opening up the shape of the problem in his head. He asked which generation of control board they were running. He asked the ambient temperature in the plant the previous night. He asked whether the error codes had appeared in sequence or all at once. The CFO answered the 3rd question, and on the other end of the line there was a span of perhaps 5 seconds that was not silence in the ordinary sense. It was the sound of somebody on the far end calculating the way a card player calculates without moving his face. Then Daniel said he would come. He arrived in a gray utility truck that was older than the shop sign and twice as scrupulously maintained. He carried a single tool case scuffed on the corners. He nodded to the plant manager, did not introduce himself to the CFO, and walked directly onto the floor. He worked for 2 hours and 20 minutes. He did not open a manual. He did not ask for a technician's help. He moved through the control bay with the unhurried exact motions of a man who already knew what was wrong and was now confirming it from 3 different directions before he touched anything that mattered. At 11:47, he flipped a breaker. The line spooled up with the smooth ascending hum of equipment returning to itself. The fault had been a failing secondary ground loop, masking a bad initialization sequence in the controller's startup chain. The manufacturer's remote diagnostic system would have needed another 2 days minimum to localize the issue, and even then, it would have called it the wrong thing. The plant manager nodded to Daniel once briefly, the way operations people nod at each other when they both already know what just happened. That was as much acknowledgement as Daniel had ever needed. What was waiting for him in the hallway outside the control bay was something different. The CFO was standing in front of a small group of mid-level managers, 6 people in pressed shirts, who had come up from various corners of the building to see what was happening. He was not addressing Daniel. He was addressing the room. The phrasing he used was the phrasing of a man who had decided the story before he had heard the ending. They had been fortunate, he told the room, to find someone available. It was convenient, he added, that the small operations rates were lighter on the quarterly budget than the larger contract firms. The word small operation came out of his mouth twice within 30 seconds, and the second time, the inflection had shifted in a way that turned the description into something else. Catherine Aldridge was standing near the back of the group looking at her phone. She did not interrupt. She did not look up while the CFO spoke. She had not been on the floor during the repair. She had arrived in the last 10 minutes the way she usually arrived. She lifted her eyes once when the CFO had finished. Her voice carried the clean finality of someone closing an item on a list. "Thank you for the quick visit," Catherine said. "If we have any small issues in the future, we'll be in touch." The word small dropped onto the hallway floor and stayed there. Daniel looked at her, then fully for the first time that morning. There was no anger in his face. There was no hunger for the recognition he was being denied. He looked at her the way a man looks at a system he is observing, registering its properties, withholding judgment, filing the readings. "You're welcome," he answered. He walked past the group of managers, past the CFO, past the polished steel sign at the front entrance, with the Aldridge name on it, in clean, upright letters, and out into the parking lot where his gray utility truck was waiting. He set the tool case in the passenger footwell. He turned the key. The engine started on the first crank because he had rebuilt it himself the previous winter, and because he had never owned a piece of equipment in his life that he did not maintain better than its manufacturer had intended. He did not look back at the building. He did not need to. He had already seen everything inside it he was going to need. Daniel drove back the way he had come, past the polished steel sign that stood at the head of the Aldridge property, like a piece of well-funded punctuation, and he kept driving until the building was no longer in his mirrors. Then he pulled off onto the shoulder of a frontage road, killed the engine, and sat with both hands resting on the bottom of the wheel. He did not move for a moment. Then he reached across to the glove box, opened it, and lifted out a manila folder that had not been disturbed in more than 2 years. The corner of the file was soft, where his thumb had handled it once and put it back. Inside was a consulting report he had written 5 years earlier on Aldridge industrial letterhead at the top of the first page, addressed by name to the CFO and copied to Catherine. The report was an assessment of the Westbrook facility, Aldridge's third plant, the one Catherine had shut down 14 months ago for what the press release had called operational inefficiency. The report ran 41 pages. Daniel had walked the floor of that building over the course of 9 days, had cataloged the equipment by serial number and condition class, and had concluded that the facility was not in fact the money trap it appeared to be on the books. The trouble was not the bones of the place. The trouble was the way it had been managed. He had delivered the report on a Friday afternoon. He had received a templated acknowledgement from the CFO's assistant the following Tuesday. He had followed up once 3 weeks later in a professional email. The reply had been another templated note. He had not followed up a second time. That was not his way. He had done the work, he had said what he saw, and what happened to it afterward was no longer his portion of the responsibility. 11 months after the report had been delivered, the Westbrook plant had been closed. The decision had been credited in the trade press to Catherine's restructuring initiative. The phrase she used in the announcement was disciplined portfolio management. Daniel had read that line in a magazine at the dentist's office and had not been able to decide in the moment whether to be angry or merely tired. He had chosen tired. Tired was cheaper to carry. Now Westbrook had been sitting on the commercial real estate market for 9 months without a serious buyer because everybody in the region had read the same announcement and concluded the same thing: the place was a money trap. Daniel was the only person outside of Aldridge who had walked every square meter of the building and knew what was actually inside it. He sat on the shoulder of the frontage road with the folder open on his lap and looked through the windshield at nothing in particular. The question in front of him was not whether the thing could be done. He had known for 5 years that it could be done. The question was whether he could do it in complete silence, buying an asset from the hand of a woman who had just dismissed him in a hallway without ever letting her see who was sitting on the other side of the signature line. He closed the folder. He started the truck. He drove home. Marcus Webb came by that night with a 6-pack of beer and no specific reason for being there. That was Marcus's way of saying he had heard something had happened and that he was available to listen if listening was wanted. They had been freshman year roommates a long time ago in a dorm with bad plumbing, and the friendship had survived through the kind of slow, sturdy maintenance that did not require regular announcement. Marcus ran a small investment fund out of an office 2 towns over. He was the kind of investor who answered his own phone and refused to take meetings that needed slide decks. He and Daniel had known each other long enough that bringing beer was the entire conversation opener. Lily was already in pajamas when Marcus arrived. She gave him a serious greeting from the top of the stairs and accepted his serious greeting back. Daniel got her to bed at the usual time. He came down and found Marcus at the kitchen table with 2 open bottles and the quiet patience of a man who had nowhere else to be. Daniel laid it out from the beginning. The call, the drive, the repair, the CFO's speech in the hallway, Catherine's closing line about small issues. He did not raise his voice while he told it, and he did not soften the parts that did not flatter him. Then he reached behind him to the counter, picked up the manila folder he had brought in from the truck, and set it on the table between them. Marcus opened the folder and read for a long time. He turned pages without comment. When he was done, he closed it carefully and aligned the edge with the edge of the table, the way a man aligns a thing he is about to make a decision about. He took a slow sip of his beer and set it down. His question came out steady. Daniel Marcus said, "Are you sure this is about the work and not about the wound?" The room was quiet for a stretch. Daniel did not answer right away. He looked through the doorway into the hall toward the half-open door of Lily's room, where a small, star-shaped nightlight was throwing a soft pattern up onto the ceiling. Then he turned back to Marcus. "If it were about the wound, he said I would have left 5 years ago when the first report I wrote got put in a drawer. This is about the work. Westbrook is a mispriced asset. I'm the only person in the market who knows by how much. The rest of it is just arithmetic." Marcus held his gaze for another moment. Then he gave a single nod. It was not the nod of a man being persuaded. It was the nod of a man who had received the answer he had needed before he was willing to commit anything else. How long, Marcus asked. 18 months from purchase to first production. Marcus sat with the number for the length of one more swallow of beer. He looked once at the folder. Then he looked back at Daniel. "I'm in," he said. Daniel did not thank him. Thanking between them would have been an insult to the seriousness of what had just been promised. He said instead that they would need to start the legal work in the morning, and that he wanted the ownership structure built to keep his name off the public face of the transaction until the deed had transferred. Marcus nodded again. He understood the reason without needing it. Explained. The Aldridge people had to sign before they realized who was sitting on the other side of the table. If Daniel's name surfaced too early, Catherine would either refuse the sale outright or raise the price beyond what the project could carry. The silence was not a courtesy. It was the operating condition of the entire plan. When Marcus said, "Tomorrow," they finished the beers. They did not toast. Toasting would have been the wrong gesture for what they had just agreed to, which was not a celebration, but a long, quiet commitment that would take 1.5 years to test. Marcus left a little after 10. He drove home along the same empty roads he had driven in on, and he thought somewhere along the way that he had just said yes to the largest single allocation his fund had ever made on a verbal commitment over a kitchen table. He was not afraid of the size. He was not even afraid of the timeline. He had been afraid for about 30 seconds in the kitchen, that the man he had known since the first week of college had been operating from a wound and hadn't realized it. He wasn't afraid of that anymore. The answer he had received was the answer of a man who had counted his motives twice before opening his mouth. After Marcus left, Daniel turned off the kitchen, light-checked the lock on the front door, and stood for a moment at the foot of the stairs. From here on, the story was no longer about what had happened in a hallway. From here on, it was a game laid out in complete silence, and the first move had already been made. Hartwell Industrial LLC came into existence on a Thursday in late October on a stack of paperwork filed in a county clerk's office 2 states away from Aldridge's headquarters. Marcus's name appeared as co-owner. Daniel's name appeared as managing director. The articles of organization were filed in the unremarkable language of small commercial entities, and the LLC took its place in the public record beside 1,000 other small commercial entities that month, none of which anyone at Aldridge had any reason to read. The Westbrook acquisition closed in early December. The CFO of Aldridge ran the transaction himself in a 30-minute meeting in a conference room on the 14th floor of the headquarters building. He spent most of those 30 minutes looking at his phone. The signing went through without questions, without due diligence, without a single verification of who on the buyer's side was actually behind the wire transfer. The deed transferred. The keys changed hands. The Aldridge corporate communications team did not issue a release because the property had been sitting unsold for 9 months and nobody saw a reason to mark the exit. The real difficulties did not begin until after the keys were in Daniel's pocket. The equipment inside Westbrook had been abandoned for over a year. The dust on the control panels had hardened. The bearings on the larger spindles had not been turned in 14 months, and idle bearings did not stay idle politely. The hangar-style roof had developed a slow leak above the receiving bay, and the moisture had crept along a section of overhead conduit that would have to be torn out and replaced before any of the original wiring could be trusted. The budget Marcus had committed gave them 14 months of runway before the project needed to generate revenue. Every week of unforeseen repair narrowed that runway. Daniel built his team out of people he had worked with at Meridian, 4 engineers. 2 of them retired. 2 of them tired enough of the corporate ladder that they had been waiting for a reason to climb back off. He did not promise them stability. He promised them work that would still be standing in 20 years. They came. The 7th month was when the line cracked. The primary CNC spindle. The central piece of equipment Daniel had identified in his original report as recoverable with targeted investment had been hiding a microfracture along the inner shaft. The crack had not been visible during the visual inspection. It had not registered on the ultrasonic scan they had run in month 3. It had only surfaced when they brought the machine up to tolerance speed and ran a test piece, and the test piece had come out of the cycle with a dimensional drift that meant somewhere inside that spindle the geometry was no longer holding. Replacing the shaft would cost $340,000 and push the timeline back 6 weeks. The contingency reserve had been spent down to the floor by the end of month 4 on smaller surprises that had each individually been survivable. This one was not survivable on what was left. Marcus drove out to the plant near 11 at night on a Tuesday in May because Daniel had not picked up either of the 2 messages he had left earlier in the day. He parked outside the main bay, walked in through the side door, and found Daniel sitting on a folding chair in the middle of the floor facing the disassembled machine. The overhead lights were off. The only illumination came from 2 work lamps on tripods, throwing long industrial shadows across the bay. Daniel was holding a coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. He did not turn his head when Marcus walked in. Marcus did not ask anything. He pulled a second folding chair over and sat down beside him. They sat there for a long stretch, without speaking the way men do when one of them has been working on a problem for too many hours, and the other has come out specifically to not require him to talk. When Daniel finally spoke, he did not look over. "If I'm wrong about this one," he said, "I'm wrong about all of it." and I dragged your money along with me." Marcus took the cold coffee out of Daniel's hand and set it on the floor. He did not respond immediately. When he did, his voice was quiet and flat, in the way a steady voice is flat when it is being deliberately steady. "You're not wrong about the machine," Marcus said. "You may have been wrong about the timeline. Those are two different things." Then he added one more sentence, and the sentence carried the weight of something he had been waiting to say for several months, and had not until now found the right opening. "And it's my money," he said. I decided that when I said yes, stop carrying it for me. Daniel did not answer for a long time. Eventually, he gave a single nod the way a man nods when he accepts a correction he had not realized he needed. The next morning before sunrise, he called a machinist. He had known 15 years earlier in Pennsylvania a man who ran a small precision shop out of a converted feed barn, and who had, in his career, custom-cut spindle shafts to tolerant specifications that the larger production houses had refused to attempt. The shaft would take 4 weeks instead of 12. It would cost an additional $90,000 on top of the replacement price. Daniel agreed to the terms inside a single phone call. He hung up, sat at the workbench for a minute, and acknowledged somewhere inside himself that he had just spent $90,000 to buy back time he could not have manufactured any other way. The acknowledgement was not comfortable. He had spent a career believing that good engineering meant controlling every variable. He was learning late that some variables were only purchasable. Meanwhile, on a Friday evening that same month, he made it home at 6 o'clock for dinner. He had committed when this project started that Fridays would remain Fridays, no matter what the calendar inside the plant looked like. Lily was on the living room rug with biscuit and a complicated structure made of plastic bricks. She looked up when he came in. "Dad," she said, "does your new company have a sign yet?" He sat down beside her on the rug and looked at what she was building. It was a small building with too many windows. "Not yet," he said. "Why not?" He thought about it. "Because I haven't finished the work inside," he said. "Putting up a sign before the work inside is done is dishonest." She nodded with the gravity of a 6-year-old receiving a piece of information she had decided to trust. Then she pushed Biscuit across the rug toward him. "You take Biscuit tomorrow," she said. "You work more than I do." He picked up the rabbit and did not say anything for a while. In the same months, on a parallel track that neither Daniel nor Marcus could see directly, Aldridge Industrial was beginning to come apart from the inside. 2 years of deferred maintenance and a restructuring program that had cut headcount faster than it had cut workload were now compounding into a slow, quiet failure of operational capacity. Catherine's program had improved margins on paper for 6 consecutive quarters. It had also hollowed out the bench of senior operators who knew how to keep older equipment running. Anyone who had spent serious time on a factory floor could have seen the trade-off from a long way off. Diane Colton, Catherine's executive assistant, had drafted an internal memorandum 9 months earlier, laying out the trend lines in customer complaint frequency and maintenance request volume. The memo had been 3 pages long and unusually direct for a document of that type. It had been routed to the CFO for review. Diane had not received a response. She had not been invited to any follow-up discussion. She had not asked for one. She had filed her copy of the memo in a drawer in her own desk and continued quietly to do her job. The 14th month brought first production on the adjusted timeline they had set after the spindle crisis, exactly when the revised schedule said it should. The replacement shaft had been installed 11 weeks after the crisis was identified. The line had been calibrated through 3 rounds of test cuts. On a cold morning in early February, the first commercial run came off the floor of the Westbrook plant. The dimensional tolerance on that initial batch came in 15% tighter than the published industry standard. Marcus stood beside Daniel in the quality control bay and read through the inspection report twice without saying anything. Then he set the clipboard down on the counter and turned to face him. "We're going to have more orders than we can schedule inside 6 months, Marcus said. "I know," Daniel answered. They did not announce the production milestone. They did not issue a release. In the precision manufacturing world, the announcements that mattered did not get made in trade journals. They got made between buyer and seller, in private, in the language of test pieces and inspection certificates. The first commercial contract came in within 8 weeks of first production. It came from a mid-tier defense contractor in Virginia. The contractor was by no coincidence the same customer whose 48-hour delivery window had been at risk on the morning Daniel had walked into the Aldridge plant. The line had been restored that day, but the restoration had come in past the contractor's internal cutoff, and the relationship had never quite recovered. The contractor had been quietly diversifying its supplier base ever since. They placed an evaluation order with Hartwell Industrial. The parts arrived on time with documentation that exceeded the contractor's own internal quality control standards. A contract proposal followed the following week. No press release was issued. Nobody at Aldridge noticed, because nobody at Aldridge had any reason to be tracking the supplier movements of a Virginia defense contractor. By month 16, Hartwell Industrial signed a second contract, this one, with a Japanese automotive parts buyer, a Tier 1 supplier that had spent the previous year searching North America for a partner capable of holding tolerances at the level its parent manufacturer demanded. The contract was valued at more than Aldridge Industrial's most recent quarterly revenue. It appeared as a single short paragraph in a trade journal company. Name, location, contract value. There was no photograph. There was no founder profile. There was no origin story. In the segment of the industry where it mattered, the paragraph said everything that needed saying. In the same quarter, Aldridge lost 2 mid-tier customers. One left over a third late delivery in the same fiscal year. The other moved to a North American supplier, whose name its purchasing director declined to share. Quarterly revenue came in 11% below the same period the year before. 2 analyst calls from the investment banking side asked pointed questions about customer retention trends. Catherine asked the CFO to handle the responses. He answered in the kind of general industry language that the analysts on the other end of the line had been in the business long enough to recognize as a man without a good answer. The CFO read the trade journal paragraph about the Japanese contract at his desk on a Wednesday afternoon. He read it twice. Then he opened a different window and ran a public record search for Hartwell Industrial LLC. He found the formation paperwork. He found the Westbrook transfer of deed. He found his own signature on the bottom of the second page. He sat with the screen for a long time without moving. Then he ran a back-of-envelope calculation on what the Westbrook facility was now generating, based on what he could infer from the announced contract values and the published equipment configuration. The number was several multiples of what he had advised the board to accept as a fair sale price. The number sat in his chest like a stone. He closed the browser. He did not open it again that day. He did not bring the discovery to Catherine. Bringing it to Catherine would have meant explaining what his due diligence had missed at the time of the sale, and explaining that would have meant volunteering information about a 1.5-year-old transaction that nobody, as far as he could tell, was currently asking him to revisit. What he did not know was that someone 2 offices away had been quietly building her own version of the same picture, and that version was being assembled with considerably more care than his own. Diane Colton had been watching the trade press for months. She had read the same paragraph the CFO had read. She had not, however, stopped at the paragraph. She had gone back to the formation documents. She had gone back further than that. And the file she was building in a drawer in her own desk was not going to be routed through the CFO when it was finished. It was going to walk straight to the woman who signed her paychecks. And by the time it did, the question of what had actually been sold and to whom was going to belong to Catherine Aldridge alone. Diane Colton worked her version of the question more carefully than the CFO had worked his. She did not stop at the formation documents. She typed Daniel Hartwell into a second search field and added the word meridian, and she did the typing slowly, the way a person types when she already suspects what is about to come back at her. What came back was not a surprise in the way that new information is a surprise. It was a surprise in the way that something you should have known for years is a surprise. The late recognition that arrives one beat behind the moment in which it would have been useful. 7 patents on the United States Patent and Trademark Office record. 11 years as a senior systems engineer at a firm whose client roster, among many other names, had included Aldridge Industrial for the better part of a decade. She did not stop there. She opened the equipment inventory file for the active Aldridge plants, a document she had access to through the operations folder she maintained for Catherine's quarterly review, and she put the 2 lists beside one another on her desk. 3 of the patents from Daniel's record, matched by serial designation to control architectures, running on 3 of Aldridge's primary production lines. The inventor field on the federal record in each case read Daniel Hartwell. She printed the relevant pages. She paired them with the Westbrook transfer of deed. She placed the assembled documents inside a file folder, and on the tab of the folder, she wrote in her ordinary, careful handwriting the name Daniel Hartwell. No subtitle, no annotation, just the name. She did not route the file through the CFO. 4 years of watching what happened to information when it passed through the CFO's hands before reaching Catherine had taught her, without anyone having to spell it out, that this file needed to walk a different hallway. She waited for the right evening. The evening came on a Thursday near the end of the quarter, when both she and Catherine were working late. Catherine reviewing forecast variances at the long conference table in her office. Diane processing correspondence at the small desk along the side wall. Around 9 o'clock, Diane carried the file across the room and set it down beside Catherine's water glass without saying anything. Catherine looked up at her, then down at the file, then opened it. She read the first page slowly, then the second, then the patent list. She lingered for a long time on the cross-reference page, the one that showed 3 of her active production lines running on architectures whose inventor field carried a single name. She turned back to the front of the file and looked at the photograph clipped to the inside cover. The photograph was a professional headshot taken 6 years earlier from a Meridian Engineering staff page that the internet had quietly preserved. A man in a dark blazer looking directly into the lens with the unflustered stillness of someone who had nothing in particular to hide. Catherine recognized the face. She recognized the way the shoulders held themselves. She recognized the quality of that stillness from a hallway many months earlier when she had barely looked up from her phone in his presence, and when she had, at the end of it, dismissed the man on the other side of the room with a sentence containing the word small. She closed the file. She sat with her hand on the cover for several long moments. Then she asked Diane in a voice that gave no indication of what it had cost to hold itself level how long the Westbrook deal had been closed. Diane gave the date. Catherine did not say anything else that night. The internal audit went open by Catherine's order the following week. It was framed to the board as a routine operational review with no specific transaction named. Diane was assigned to support the audit team, which meant she had legitimate access to the full documentary record around the CFO's handling of the Westbrook divestiture. The record was not clean. The asset valuation the CFO had accepted and advised the board to approve had not been supported by an independent appraisal. The due diligence checklist showed risk flags that had been initialed but not substantively addressed. There was an entire section of the file related to verification of the purchasing entity's principles, and the verification box had simply been left blank. It was procedural failure compounded by reporting failure, and the second was worse than the first because it had taken place continuously and by choice. The CFO submitted his resignation 4 days before the audit findings were scheduled for formal presentation to the board. He sent it by email in 3 short sentences, citing the pursuit of other opportunities. Catherine accepted it without reply. That was the end of the part of the story that ran on the Aldridge side of the wall. On the Hartwell side, nothing had visibly changed. The plant ran its shifts. The Japanese contract moved into its first delivery cycle. Daniel came in at 6 in the morning and left at 6 in the evening when Lily had a school event, and at 9 when she did not. He had not, in the nearly 2 years since the Westbrook closing, ever once said the words, Catherine Aldridge, out loud in his own building. He did not need to. The work was the answer to that name, and the work was answering it every day on time to specification, without commentary. What he did not yet know was that the woman on the other side of that name was about to make the first call she had ever placed to him directly. Catherine made the call herself. She did not have her assistant place it. She found the number through the attorney who had handled the Westbrook closing, and it took one phone call because Daniel had never been hiding. He had simply never been asked. He answered on the second ring. She said her name. There was a quiet at the other end, not the quiet of awkwardness, but the quiet of a man deciding how to answer, not whether to answer. Then he said hello. She told him she would like to meet in person to discuss a potential supply arrangement. He told her he had availability Tuesday morning. She asked which location would be most convenient for him. He told her the Hartwell shop. She told him she would be there at 9. She arrived alone. No assistant, no driver, no briefcase. The morning was gray and cool, and she stood on the curb in front of the rust-bitten sign for a few seconds before she walked under it. It was the first time she had ever come inside. On the day she had laughed at the sign, she had not crossed the threshold. Now she did, and the shop revealed itself to her in a sequence of details she had not been prepared to read. The tools on the pegboard, each one hanging inside the painted outline that marked its place. The workbenches swept clean with calibration gauges, set out in the same considered order. A surgeon set out instruments. The framed photograph on the back wall, a small group of engineers standing in front of a newly completed production facility. Daniel, a decade younger, second from the left, holding a roll of schematics under his arm. And on the corner of the main workbench, beside a coffee mug, with a hairline crack along the rim, a small white plush rabbit with button eyes, and one ear visibly more frayed than the other. She looked at the rabbit for a moment, and then looked away. Daniel came in from the back room with 2 mugs of coffee. He set one down in front of her, without asking whether she wanted it, and he sat down on the stool across the workbench from her. She put both hands around the mug the way a person does when she is buying herself the right kind of moment, and she said the thing she had come to say before any other thing got said. She told him she had reviewed his background. She told him she understood now who she had been working with on the morning of the breakdown, and that she had been wrong about more than one element of that morning. She told him she wanted to discuss a long-term supply arrangement for precision components on terms that reflected the actual value of what his operation produced. Daniel listened to the entire proposal without interrupting. When she had finished, he told her he appreciated the directness. Then he added one more sentence in a voice that carried neither anger nor judgment, only the weight of a thing that needed to be said out loud once before either of them moved any further. "Do you remember that afternoon at the second facility?" he asked. She held his eyes. She did not look away, and she did not reach for the easy apology that would have closed the moment too quickly. She told him she did. He told her he did not need anything from her about that day. He told her what had happened. Then was what had happened, and that he was not losing sleep over it. But he wanted her to understand that the repair shop was real, and the work was real, and he had not been ashamed of any part of it on the morning she had stood in his doorway and laughed. She held the look. She did not break it. "I understand that now," she said. It was not an apology. It was something more specific than an apology. It was an acknowledgement delivered directly into the face of the person it was owed to by a woman who had spent the previous month learning in considerable detail what she had failed to see. She slid the file across the workbench. Daniel did not open it. He let it rest between them and asked one question. "Why me?" he said. "You have 3 other North American suppliers capable of meeting most of your specifications. Why not them? The room was quiet for what felt like a long stretch, though it was not. She set her coffee down carefully and looked at the surface of the workbench for a moment before she answered. Because those three, she said, will deliver on time for 2 years, and then they will start delivering late when they find better customers. You will deliver on time for 20 years because that is how you work. I need the second one. I have spent too long learning that there is a difference. Daniel looked at her for a long moment. It was an answer he had not been expecting, not because it was beautiful, but because it was true, and because it had not bothered to make itself beautiful first. He drew the file toward him and opened it. He did not read it carefully there. He told her he would review it and respond within the week. She accepted that without pressing. She stood, gathered her coat, and walked toward the door. At the threshold, she turned and looked once at the sign above the entrance. The hand-painted letters, with their rust-bitten corners, the sign she had once laughed at within hearing of her own staff. She did not laugh now. She read it as information. The name of the man and the place where he worked. Nothing more, nothing less. 3 weeks later, Daniel signed. He did not sign because he needed it. Hartwell Industrial had reached the point at which it could sustain and grow on its own terms, and the Aldridge contract was by then one offer among several waiting for his review. He signed because of the sentence Catherine had spoken in his shop that morning, the one about 20 years versus 2, and because he had spent the better part of his career believing that good work should travel to wherever it could be put to the best use, regardless of who happened to be holding the door open. He said as much to his attorney as they reviewed the final language. Good work should go where it can be put to best use, he said. The attorney did not respond. There was nothing to add. On a Saturday morning, a few weeks after the contract was signed, Daniel took the old sign down himself. He climbed the ladder with a socket wrench, worked the bolts out of the wooden board behind the steel face, and lowered the sign down to the pavement, one careful piece at a time. Lily stood beneath the ladder in a coat that was slightly too big for her, holding Biscuit looking up. When the old sign was off, she asked what the new sign would say. He climbed down and stood beside her, and they both looked at the clean rectangle of brick where the old name had been. Just Hartwell, he said. She thought about that for a moment, and nodded with the seriousness 6-year-olds reserve for decisions they have been allowed to be part of. So the inside work is done now, she asked. He looked down at her. The first part is, he said. Good work is never quite done. The new sign went up that afternoon. Clean, flat, simple. A single word in dark lettering on a brushed metal face. No descriptor. No qualifier. The name had always been enough. The world had simply taken its time learning to read it correctly. In the kind of city where people move quickly and judge by the surface, Daniel Hartwell's story was never going to be told loudly. There would be no interview. There would be no founder profile. The trade journals would mention Hartwell Industrial occasionally, when a contract was large enough to register. The number of people who knew the whole story could have fit comfortably in the front room of a small repair shop. He had done it without an announcement. He had done it without revenge. Those were not the tools he worked with. He had done it the way he had fixed the machine that morning, quietly, precisely, completely. And when the work was done, he turned off the lights and went home to his daughter.